The Sicilian defense is the opening e4, c5. It often continues knight f3, d6, d4. This is the open Sicilian. Pawns get exchanged on d4. Knight f6 attacks the e4 pawn. Knight c3 defends it. And the move g6 is called the dragon variation. Black intends to fianchetto his bishop. There are several moves white makes in this position. In this video, we're going to look at the very aggressive move f4. This is called the Levenfish attack. The point of the move is to support the pawn push e5, and we'll look at some continuations from this position by looking at some grandmaster games. So this game is from 1948, and the players played the same opening moves of the dragon variation, and then f4, the Levenfish attack. Now, in this particular game, black doesn't address white's threat of pushing to e5 at all and continues on with his plan of fianchettoing his bishop. We're going to see how white punishes that move. White plays e5, and black decides to exchange pawns on e5, but let's look at one other possible move. The knight is under attack, so it might go to h5. On h5, you may notice it has no safe squares. So it's tempting to try to trap the knight by playing g4 in this position, but that's a mistake. Black has knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, d takes e5, forking the minor pieces, recovering the piece, and black has the better game. So instead, after knight to h5, white should continue bishop to b5 check. The best way to block the check is with bishop to d7, but then white has the promising move e6. Notice the bishop cannot take, it is pinned, and if the pawn takes, knight takes e6 looks very strong. So black may have to subject himself to the move e takes f7 next. So white is doing quite well in that position. So back to the position after e5. In the game, black exchanged pawns and then made a mistake and played knight to g4. Putting the knight on g4 in the Sicilian defense is often an error. It can lose to a tactical sequence. Instead, black should have played his knight to d7, but this does allow the strong pawn push again, e6. And black can hang on with the move knight to e5, guarding f7, but white's position is better. So back to the game, black played knight to g4. Now here's why that's a mistake. White has bishop to b5 check, and black blocks with the knight. There's no other way to block the check. If black puts a minor piece on d7, then the g4 knight is lost. This bishop is pinned. If black moves the king over, then knight to e6 check will win the queen on d8. So the only move in the position is knight to c6, which looks bad. It looks like white can play knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes c6, and fork the king and the rook. But black does have a way to save his material. Black plays after knight takes c6, he plays queen takes d1 check, knight takes d1, and then the very clever move a6. Black would like to play bishop to d7 to block the diagonal and win a minor piece back, but the problem is the knight can move away and protect the bishop on b5, and white would remain up a piece. So before moving bishop to d7, black plays a6, forcing the bishop back to a4, then bishop to d7. Now if the knight moves, it will not be able to guard the bishop on a4. Okay, so white is going to lose the piece and black will gain it back, but white would like to at least win this e7 pawn in the process. If he does that now, black will end up winning the e5 pawn because the knight was guarding it. So first, white pushes his pawn to h3, forcing the black knight back to h6, then takes on e7 and gives up the bishop on a4. Then white gets his knight to safety. So after that long sequence, you can see that white is up a pawn in this position, and that was a consequence of black's move knight to g4. All right, black played rook d8, attacking the knight. c4 solidifies it in the center. And now this knight moves to f5, which is a threat. Bishop takes e5, because when the knight was on h6, the bishop can't take the pawn without losing the knight on h6. So the knight moves, and that does threaten the pawn on e5. But white takes the time to threaten the rook on d8, bishop to g5, rook d7, and then knight 1 c3 attacks the bishop on a4. So the bishop retreats to c6, and now white castles. And by this time, it's no longer possible to take the pawn on e5, because rook from h to e8 to e1 pins it and will win it very soon. So black pushes h5, and then white makes an excellent move, knight to c7 check. The point is the rook can't take the knight because there's an immediate mate on d8. So instead the king is forced over to f8, but then rook takes d7, bishop takes d7, and rook to d1 is going to win a piece. This bishop cannot move off the square. If it does, black will get mated. Check and mate. So the bishop has to stay there, and there's no way to protect it. Black took the pawn on e5, white took the bishop, and black played several more moves before resigning, but white is up a piece in the position. All right, let's look at another game. This one's from 1999, and let's see if black can put up some more resistance to this Levenfish attack. So here is the dragon variation, and then f4 is the Levenfish attack. So the threat again is pushing the pawn to e5. It turns out the best move for black is to play knight to c6 to defend that square. But white can exchange knights, removing the defender, and then push e5. But the difference is, after removing the defender on c6, a pawn shows up on c6, and so white no longer has bishop to b5 check in some lines. So this is not as dangerous for black as the other variation we saw with bishop to g7 instead of knight to c6. Okay, here black plays knight to d7. That's the best move in the position. And then e takes d6, e takes d6, and now queen to d4 attacks the rook in the corner, gains a tempo, vacates the queen off of d1, and white intends to castle on the queen side. Knight to f6 blocks the attack on the rook, bishop to e3 getting ready to castle, and now a very good move, bishop to e7. Very strange looking move. It's a rare occurrence in the dragon variation to put the bishop on e7 rather than g7, but it's actually a necessity in this position. If black had moved the bishop to g7, then white could have played long castles, which attacks the d6 pawn with the rook and queen. So black would be forced to advance the pawn to d5, but then white would have queen to c5, and that would keep black from castling because the bishop has left that diagonal. And the position is better for white. So that's why black played bishop to e7. Then long castles, short castles, and now h3 keeps the knight off of g4 to harass the bishop. And then d5 opens up the diagonal here and secures a nice outpost for a knight on e4. But it also leaves control of the c5 square, and white kind of dives for that square with knight to a4 heading for it. But unfortunately, that's probably a bad move because it just it just left control of e4 and allowed black to play their knight to e4 before white can get his knight to c5, and black is now protecting the c5 square. So white played bishop e2, connecting the rooks, bishop e6, and now if you look at the position, I would say black is winning because black has a ready-made queenside attack. Black has some pretty obvious moves to make, like queen to a5, rook to b8. The other rook can get into the game. This bishop can go to f6, protected by the knight. And everything will be pointed at the queen side here. So white kind of tried something desperate and played f5 to open up some lines. After bishop takes f5, we now have an open diagonal, we have an open or half open f-file, so white sacks that pawn for some open lines. It's not good enough though. Bishop to h6 attacks the rook. Black makes a good Zwischenzug, bishop to f6 attacking the queen, queen to e3, and then the rook moves over, queen to f4, queen to a5, attacking the knight, b3 to protect it, knight to c3, forking everything. Okay, this bishop is also doing an excellent job. We now have some very weak dark squares thanks to the move b3. Bishop to d3, saving the bishop from being captured, but that leaves knight takes a2 check. King to b1, knight to c3 check. King to c1. White can't step on a dark square here because there would be a discovery check by the bishop. So king's forced back to c1. Rook to e4, excellent move, getting another piece into the attack, attacking the queen, attacking the knight, and the white bishop cannot take because it leaves control of e2. Knight to e2 would be a deadly fork. So the rook cannot be taken, so the queen has to move away. It moves to d6, but then bishop to e7, another excellent move, attacking the queen, pointed at this square. There's going to be a check here that's going to be deadly. So queen takes c6, but that just opens another file for rook to c8, pointed right at the white king. Queen to a6, hoping for a trade of queens. Rook takes a4, excellent exchange sacrifice and protecting the queen on a5. B takes a4 allowed the crushing move knight to e2 check, releasing this rook. White resigned here because if, for example, bishop takes knight, there's going to be a quick mate with rook takes c2 check, king to b1 is forced, and then the queen can come in, queen to b4 check, and then king in the corner, and then, for example, queen to b2 is mate. And there's no other defense in the position. So white lost, and we saw a good defense to the Levenfish, and this is the way you should play it if you're black. If you see f4, play knight c6. Just remember that key square, e5, must be protected. If white exchanges knights and pushes anyway, you're safer than you would have been if you didn't have this diagonal blocked. Okay, you can drop the knight back. White can exchange pawns, but black is doing okay in this position. Black is safe in this position. Queen to d4, knight f6, and so forth. Oh, I did want to mention two more things about this opening. After knight c6, if white doesn't want to do the plan of exchanging the defender of e5 and then pushing e5, there are a couple of alternatives. For example, bishop to b5, pinning the knight, trying to put more pressure on it. But then black has bishop to d7, and maybe white exchanges his bishop for the knight on c6. And then b takes c6, and then pushes e5. In this case, black has knight to d5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, e takes d6, and then the excellent move e6, keeping the pawn structure intact, intending bishop takes d6 next. So if played carefully, black is fine in that line as well. And then one more move you can make in this position after knight c6 as white is you can play it more quietly. You can retreat your knight. Instead of taking it, you can retreat it back to f3. In fact, there was a game where Judith Polgar made that move and beat Topalov with it. So she played a quiet positional game. For example, black might finish their fianchetto, bishop d3, castles, castles, bishop g4, and just continue developing. Good move here, by the way, is queen e1, getting out of the pin and getting ready to block a check on that dark diagonal here. Okay, so that's it for the Levenfish attack. Thanks for watching the video.